Hello, I'm Terry Newman, Senior Editor and columnist at National Post. I'd like to welcome our viewers to Immigration Overdrive, the first of a series of live interactive events on topics that matter most to Canadians. As a reminder, audience members can submit questions for our guests, the Honorable Jason Kenney, former and longest standing Immigration Minister for Canada. Thank you for taking the time to join us to answer our questions today, Mr. Kenney. I can't think of anyone more qualified to do so.
Great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Perfect. So before we begin, some housekeeping items. Basically some instructions for audience members for optimal participation in this live event. If your video quality is poor, click here to refresh stream. If you're having any technical issues during the event, click on help on the bottom right corner of your webcast page. Your help request will be emailed back to the email address you provided. To ask a question, simply click on the questions tab on the far right of your screen. Enter your question in the window and they will be sent directly to us. We will ask Mr. Kenney your questions towards the end of the discussion. So some background here. Since 2015, annual immigration increased from 271,800 with an expected increase to 485,000 by the end of 2024. This does not include temporary residents. That's an increase of 78.4% since the Harper government. Immigration has cascading effects on other important areas of our economy, including housing supply, access to healthcare, and youth employment. This is why it's important that governments get it right. Mr. Kenney, Canadians want to understand how changes to the immigration system under the Liberals have impacted them. But could you start by giving them some insight into the system itself? For example, what should be the goal of Canada's immigration system?
Well, when I was immigration minister for 5 years, I always used to say that we should be proud that Canada is one of the only democracies with a fairly robust pro-immigration consensus, but we shouldn't take that for granted. We have to be intentional about demonstrating, showing people practically that immigration benefits Canada and Canadians and also newcomers. That means there's an obligation on us to be a welcoming society, but also a reciprocal obligation on newcomers to integrate and to be loyal to their new homeland, and particularly if, of course, they're becoming citizens. So I think the goal there is successful economic and social integration. On the economic side, it's easier to measure that with sort of metrics, with data in terms of average incomes. Historically, over time, selected economic immigrants in Canada would usually, after a decade, be earning more than folks born in Canada, showing a lot of upward mobility. So historically, there was pretty good data to suggest that the core of certainly our point system selected immigrants were doing well. And, others refugees and others, family class immigrants might not be advancing as quickly economically, but over time, their kids certainly would, and they would contribute in many other ways, often starting businesses and the like. On the register of what I call social integration, that's kind of more qualitative. It's a little bit more abstract and harder to measure. But I think, you can look at this in terms of civic literacy, how aware are people of newcomers about Canada's history, identity, values, and we as a Harper government, we tried to upgrade all of those things in the citizenship program. I think you can look at it in the density of so-called ethnic enclaves. Are people tending just intergenerationally to live in communities that demographically resembled their countries of origin, or is there more mixing going on? To what extent are they entering national institutions, military service, and service in the police and other public services, for example? Those are some of the things I would look at to measure social integration. So I think those are the two key things we have to keep an eye on. And we also have to realize, one last point here. I always used to say that while we are a open and welcoming and generous country, there are practical limits to our generosity. You could be a very charitable family, but you can only give what you have. And in Canada, like anywhere, we have a scarcity of housing, a scarcity of available healthcare, a scarcity of available jobs. It does grow with the economy. And so it's irresponsible to grow immigration levels beyond what we can reasonably accommodate. And I would also say beyond the pace of our capacity to successfully integrate people.
That makes sense, of course. You don't want newcomers coming here and not having a place to live. In general, though, what are the key indicators among those who succeed? Are there certain characteristics or qualities that people have that they generally come into Canada and do well and succeed?
Sure. Thankfully, there's a lot of data on this. Immigration Canada, it's Stats Can, and academics have been researching those issues for decades. So there's a pretty good data set that certainly governed the reforms that I led as immigration minister, quite sweeping and fundamental reforms in the Harper government. The data tells us historically that the immigrants most likely to succeed economically, measured by, for example, the highest incomes and employment rates, tend to be people who came to Canada at a younger age, have degrees from Canadian universities. I'm making a very clear distinction between that and short-term diplomas from like these diploma mills that we've been dealing with lately. And people who have high levels of English language proficiency. Bilingual country, French is important, but English is increasingly the global language of business. So the data indicates those three indicators: relative youth, Canadian education with degrees that will be recognized by Canadian employers, and English language proficiency as well as Canadian work experience. So those tend to be the immigrants who succeed. Now, listen, we obviously we can welcome people here as refugees with no English or French language proficiency, minimal formal education, no Canadian education. And some of those people over time will be very industrious and do very well. But as a population, quite intuitively, they end up doing much less well than the kind of younger Canadian educated folks I referred to. And by the way, what I'm saying is not an opinion, it's data.
Right, that makes sense. They might have to rely on intergenerational mobility, for example, instead. Now, moving on, I know it's been quite a while, but what kind of immigration system did your government inherit from the preceding Liberal government under Paul Martin?
Well, I would say that we inherited what was fundamentally a sound system, but there were a lot of problems that had metastasized over time. You know, immigration has always been considered sort of the third rail of Canadian politics, like you touch it, you die. And so we inherited a system which had not been properly managed. I mean, we had I think fundamentally a good system in terms of the point system. That's the core of the selection of economic immigrants. But there had not been tools for the Canadian government to limit the number of applications that we were getting. Canada was legally obliged to process to completion every application that it received in every category of immigration in a world of 8-9 billion people, with billions in the developing world who want to migrate to developed, prosperous countries like Canada. You have like virtually infinite demand for migration to a place like Canada. And that was starting to be seen in huge and growing unmanageable backlog. So we came to office, the Harper government in 2006, and inherited backlogs of approaching 1 million. And then shortly thereafter was well over 1 million people just in the skilled workers program, that one big economic immigration program, and large and growing backlogs for asylum, family reunification, parents and grandparents, and other categories. This practically meant that if you were like an ideal immigrant abroad and you applied to come to Canada, you'd have to wait about 7 years for us to even get back to you with an answer. And that was untenable. It meant people were aging out. They were looking you have to understand, there is a global competition for talent on the supply side, if you will, of the migration equation. Billions of people who would like to migrate to develop, prosperous, democratic countries like Canada. And on the demand side, in Canada, if you will, there's Australia, US, UK, and others always trying to select for immigrants most likely to succeed and add most to national wealth. And so if you have a really clunky, slow-moving, inefficient system, you're kind of deterring some of the best and brightest, and you're certainly not able to attract them. So we brought in really important reforms, the power of what's called ministerial instructions, which said that the minister can limit the number of applications that we will take every year. In the Harper years, we were taking about 250,000 people a year as permanent residents. And before we came to office, there was like 500,000, twice as many applications coming in. So we said, no, we're going to align the number of applications to the number of people that we admit. We're not going to oversell the airplane, if you will, with more tickets sold than seats available. That was hugely important. We also inherited a system in 2006 that where I would say the integrity of the system was being undermined. Now, on this point, I always used to say that if you want to maintain public support for immigration, you have to show that it is a system with integrity, with the consistent application of fair rules. In other words, you got to prevent and stop queue jumping and people from going around the legal, the normal process and waiting patiently. I remember I did an immigration town hall about my reforms in Scarborough circa 2012, and the lovely lady, Ms. Johnson, Ivy Johnson, stood up. I'll never forget her. And she said, Minister Kenney, before I came here 40 years ago from Jamaica, worked hard, played by the rules, came the right way. And I worked really hard to raise my family in Canada, but now I watch a lot of people sneaking in the back door and the side windows. And she said, you finally locked the back door and closed the side windows and said, if you want to come to Canada, come the right way by taking your turn through the front door. That's a good metaphor for what we need to have. Unfortunately, we saw a huge and growing number of false asylum claims in our refugee determination system. We saw a growing volume of human smuggling, human trafficking, fake immigration marriages, dodgy immigration consultants, dodgy diploma mills trying to exploit the foreign student program. And eventually we saw a growing abuse in particularly the low-skilled stream of the temporary foreign worker program. So our government went systematically through all of those areas of abuse and did what we could to close the back door and the side windows.
That sounds great. Makes sense. Now, looking ahead, I know you're not currently in government, but you probably have been paying close attention to this. Not in either government, I should say. What kind of immigration system do you think that the Conservatives are going to be inheriting from Justin Trudeau's Liberals if they win in October? And yeah, and what changes did the Liberals make to your program that will require additional reform?
Yeah, look, what I'm going to say is not colored by partisanship. And what I'm going to say, I think, is becoming pretty quickly a consensus, including from a lot of sort of centrist and even traditionally liberal-leaning academics. I think that the Trudeau government has catastrophically mismanaged the Canadian immigration system in just about every way conceivable. I mentioned all those reforms the Harper government did. They opposed almost all of them. But even then, come to think of it, when Michael Ignatieff was leader of the Liberal opposition back in the day, I was able to get really fundamental asylum system reforms through with conditional Liberal support, because at least he and others were more grown-ups and more realists about widespread abuse and the need for integrity in the system. All of that seemed to go out the window when the Trudeau government came to office. They seemed to be blinded by a kind of deeply naive approach, like this, repeating these slogans, diversity is our greatest strength. And when Trump came to office, basically inviting alleged asylum claimants from around the world to come to Canada, which led to a huge flood in claims, which led to huge backlogs, which means slower processing times, which means more people come to get into that queue. And they doubled the permanent residency numbers overnight, even though the system wasn't set up to handle that. And then they opened floodgates on both the foreign student program and the temporary foreign worker program. And so now at the end of the day, you're looking at like 500,000 permanent resident landings a year, 1 to 1.3 million temporary residents entering the country every year, a growth in at least 3 million in our population in the past 3 years, in the midst of a pre-existing housing crisis and a public health crisis, which is because of the obvious scarcity of healthcare providers and so on. And they did this and they also did it even though the economic data is very clear. High levels of lower skilled immigrants in every developed country in post-war history is correlated to declining per capita GDP. And what have we seen as a consequence of the Trudeau policy? He was on American TV a couple of weeks ago saying, well, Canada's economy is growing. Yeah, in absolute terms, when you bring millions of new people into the country, there's going to be additional demand. But in relative terms, we are one of the only developed countries in the world whose economy is actually shrinking. For 6 straight years, our per person gross domestic product, that is, if you take the total economic output of the country divided by the population, we've been declining on that metric now for 6 years. We've now gone down to the same per capita GDP as Alabama in the United States. I think it's, the 47th poorest of the 50 United States. We have taken a housing crisis and massively worsened it. Last year, we built about 220,000 housing units in Canada, but added 1 to 1.3 million people to our population. We have foreign students living 25 to an apartment, sleeping in shifts. Our homeless shelters are overflowing. Food bank usage has tripled, quadrupled. We frequently have average wait times to access a physician in Canadian hospitals and emergency wards at 24 hours or longer. I would argue all of these things were predictable and to a great extent preventable if they had maintained a prudent immigration policy. And I think part of this was, they got so carried away with their own rhetoric and frankly, their own politics on this. They imagined that if anybody objected to these unmanageably high, unprecedented numbers, not just unprecedented in Canada, but really unprecedented in modern history across the developed West, they imagined if anybody objected to it, they could just call them racist and shut it down. And I think in some ways they thought they were creating a political trap for their partisan adversaries. They've fallen into that trap. And by the way, it's immigrants, it's new Canadians who are, in my experience, and according to polling, the most likely to oppose these unsustainably high levels of both permanent and temporary residents, because it's newcomers who tend to be at the bottom of the job market, hardest to get jobs, the bottom of the housing market, hardest to find housing, the bottom of the healthcare market, they're newcomers, hardest to get a new family physician. So I just think, and by the way, they've blown out the integrity of the system. In 2013, after my asylum system reforms, we were down to about 10,000 new refugee claims a year. This year, we're on track. We have at 120,000 for the first 8 months of the year. So we're on track for 180,000 refugee claims, 18 times more, 1,800% increase in refugee claims alone. And let me just add this: if we end up with this huge, with this huge population of foreign students, we have something like 3 to 4 million temporary residents in the country. That's foreign students, temporary foreign workers, people on asylum claims. As they fall out of status, as their visas expire, some of them will do the right thing and go home, but others, all of the pressures on them from their families abroad to stay here, and others are going to overstay. We see a growing trend of the foreign students and temporary foreign workers whose visas have expired shifting into the asylum system, because word has gone out in the kind of migration channels and the circuits. I mean, there are folks who are constantly communicating about how do you stay in Canada, how do you get a work permit, how do you extend your status, how do you get permanent residency. And the word on the street is that if you're a foreign student, you're a foreign worker, you've timed out on your visa, you just walk down to an immigration office and say, I am making a refugee application, an asylum application. That gets you an open work permit. It gets you a guaranteed healthcare, public healthcare coverage. It keeps you in the country for now because of the backlog, probably 2 or 3 years before you get to a asylum hearing. And then you'll make an appeal in what's a broken system. You'll be like 4, 5, 6 years before you get, if you're not really a refugee, before you get a final notice to leave. And by then you've been here for so long, you'll make a Hail Mary application. It's called a humanitarian and compassionate application to stay permanently. And who knows, then you'll have maybe a decent chance of getting it. And by the way, the Liberals, as far as I can tell, they've also basically told the Immigration Refugee Board to completely loosen up the traditional criteria for assessing asylum claims. So we're now getting, like, amongst our top source countries are well-established democracies with independent judiciaries like India and Mexico. Those are not perfect countries. Tell me one that is. And they're running at a 50% approval rate on their asylum claims, which is like 4 times higher than it used to be. I'm sorry to ramble, but the point is you put all of that together, you're going to have a huge and growing number of people who are here illegally, quotes, out of status, a huge and growing number of people here in the asylum system, making it dysfunctional. And then if President Trump wins the US election on a commitment for, quotes, massive deportations and basically shutting down de facto access to the American asylum system for millions of illegals in the US, I predict you're going to have a huge flood north of many of those folks trying their chances here. So I think we are on the cusp. Things are very bad now, but they could become unsustainably, like we could have a true crisis in terms of homelessness and pressure on our social systems just months away.
Yeah, so what you're pointing out is basically the types of abuses that you were used to seeing in the system when you were in government, usually by applicants, sponsorship, consultants, diploma mills, fake schools, stuff like that, have only been exacerbated by the Liberal government basically empathetically loosening these rules so that eventually people will get their status anyway. So that's interesting. And you've also mentioned
not in their
as well
defense, but I should also point out that some of the reforms we made, a few, not many, were also suspended by the courts. Like we had in our asylum system a accelerated and truncated claim for refugee claimants coming from what we designated as safe countries of origin, democracies with independent judiciaries and low asylum acceptance rates, which is common sense. It happens in many other countries, totally compliant with the Universal Convention on Refugees, but that was suspended by the court. So these are some of the things that a prospective future Conservative government is going to have to deal with.
Exactly. So you'd already mentioned the radical increase, almost 2,000% for asylum seekers. It's getting up there. This summer, I want to talk a little bit about the vetting process for the immigration system. This summer, a terror attack planned by a father and son duo, the LDDs, was thankfully foiled. The father came to Canada in 2018 and became a citizen this past May, just before the planned attack. And only after he became a citizen did CSIS discover that he was a member of ISIS and had even been in one of their videos. So Canadians want to know, how robust is Canada's immigration vetting process? And is it the same for all pathways?
No. On the second question, no, it's not. So to be accepted as a permanent residency, there's a legal requirement statutory requirement that you go through security screening. You get, which means that basically your file is referred by immigration once they've approved it to the Canada Border Services Agency, which does its own review. They also check it against the databases of their sister agencies like the RCMP and CSIS to see if there's any hits, like a national security hit or criminal record that they're aware of, et cetera. Obviously, the applicant has to bring a documentation from their country of origin indicating they don't have a serious criminal record and so forth. Because if they do, if they have the serious criminal record, then they are criminally inadmissible for permanent residency in Canada. Now, so how robust is that system? Well, let's put it this way. The government has doubled the number of permanent residents with only a marginal increase in the resources for the CBSA, RCMP, and CSIS. So a system that was set up to screen 250,000 people is now trying to screen 500,000 people. In addition to that, you've got the 1 million plus temporary residents being admitted to Canada every year, workers, foreign workers, students, et cetera. And they don't go through a security screen. Go figure. And so, if now,
So the application
I should
process
say
would
this.
be
I mean, to
the,
get a visa from a lot of those countries, or an electronic travel authorization, there will be a quick check of your you're going to have to submit a photograph, fingerprints, your name, documentation, and there will be a quick check, but it's not a robust full screen. And so that is a fairly porous screening process on the temporary residence side. And I do not think we are nearly as well resourced or rigorous on the permanent residency side. All of this is tragic, because after 9/11, let me put it this way, the US said, remember they closed the border from Canada to the United States for 48 hours. There was a massive impact on the Canadian economy. And the Chrétien government realized that we needed to prove to the Americans, to Washington, that we were as serious as they were about immigration security, continental security. So we spent billions of dollars under the Chrétien and Harper governments upgrading immigration security screening, aligning our policies to a large extent with the United States. Harper government did a lot of this, for example, and biometric visas and information sharing treaties and exit entry information system and things like this. But I think since those efforts to really tighten things up in the 2000s, that under the Trudeau government, it's just been incredibly weakened.
okay, thank you for that. In May of 2023, Canada issued a student visa to Pakistani national Muhammad Khan. A month later, he waltzed into Pearson Airport, and 5 months later, he began planning a terrorist attack for October 7th, which was thankfully foiled. I bring this up because you've previously stated that you think the ideal economic immigrant to Canada is a foreign student who has done their degrees at a Canadian university, who has perfected their English skills and is in their early 20s. Muhammad Khan, in that case, appears to have been an ideal economic immigrant based on that description, in an ideal world, of course. But we unfortunately do not live in an ideal world, and that fact is becoming clearer. Given that Canada and our way of life has foreign enemies, shouldn't our student and other immigration pathways be realistically prepared for this reality? Should our immigration system be employing negative discretion when it considers who should be allowed to study, work, and live in Canada? And if you don't mind, could you take a moment to define negative discretion for the audience?
Yeah, negative discretion basically means that the Minister of Immigration and or his delegates, which would be in this case would be CBSA officers or immigration officers, can basically say no to people based on certain criteria. Now, let me say the only way you could eliminate the risk of a newcomer posing a threat to national security is to have no newcomers. And that's not my view. And I think 95% of Canadians would think that's extreme. So then what you have to do is manage the risk intelligently. You have to have robust immigration security screening. You have to be hard-headed about this. Now, let me give you an example. When I was, within 2 months of becoming immigration minister in 2008, I flew to one of our major processing centers in Damascus, Syria. I think I was the only Canadian minister to have been in Syria since the early mid-90s, by the way, because of that visit. And at that time, we were processing all of our Iranian, Lebanese, Syrian, and certain other Middle Eastern temporary and permanent visa applications out of that operation. And the primary reason I went there is I wanted to really drill down with the actual people on the line making the decisions on what we were doing for screening. Like, Terry, let me tell you, when I was appointed Minister of Immigration, the very first thought that came to my mind was I wanted to do everything humanly possible to ensure that nobody would come into Canada under my watch who might be responsible for a sequel to 9/11. That's the kind of thing that kept me awake at night, excuse me. And so that's why I went to Damascus, in particular, because we were processing large numbers of Iranian visas. And the Persian community in Canada was telling me about a large and growing number of people associated with the regime who had profited from their proximity to or in collaboration with the Islamic dictatorship in Tehran, members of the Basiji militia, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, the Al-Quds Force, senior members of the regime, their family members, their in-laws. I was being told, we're coming to Canada, laundering money, buying property, getting study permits, etc. So I wanted to figure out what could we do to stop that or significantly mitigate it, prevent it. And I spent a full day in the top secret, soundproof security room in our Damascus embassy with CSIS, CBSA, RCMP, Immigration Canada, Foreign Affairs, walking through particular applications, asking where they were sourcing their information. And that was part of a process that I led in part, significantly to improve the process. Now, I'll ask you the question. Do you think that the Liberal immigration ministers have been concerned about these things? I mean, I really don't. And partly the officials will respond to where the political priority and attention is. Okay? So I think that with the pressure on the system has been to facilitate these huge numbers, which means accelerating approvals and applications, not doing so carefully. We have virtually no in-person interviews between Canadian, like if you came to Canada 50 years ago, you almost certainly, as an economic immigrant, for example, would have had a first face-to-face interview with a Canadian immigration officer abroad where they could get, and here this comes to your point about negative discretion, they could get a qualitative sense of you as an individual. Did your story on paper check out with what you were saying in person? Like they could do that they could ask people truth-telling questions about their backgrounds to make sure they really got that university degree.
They could do a vibe check.
Right. It's a vibe check. There you go. And none of that happens anymore. In the United States, as a matter of law, requires an in-person interview with a visa officer to get even a visitor visa to come to the United States. We have zero in-person interviews anymore. Most of those applications are now processed here in country. We used to have a system where most of them were done abroad, where our local staff, who, by the way, many of whom were phenomenal and very loyal to Canada, would have the cultural cues. I remember in Damascus, I could tell you something I've never said publicly before, but I had a reception with all of the local staff because I wanted to make sure they were aligned with our interests. I had heard rumors to the contrary, and I was concerned that maybe the Syrian government had tentacles into our office. And so I met with our local staff, and a lot of them came up to me and said, "Minister, we're so glad you came, but you've got to tell your Canadian officers to listen to us because we know who the bad people are." By which they meant they knew the local cultural cues and, people's political affiliations and those who were problematic or had extremist ideas. So we've flushed all of that away effectively, and it's a numbers game as they're trying to push as many people into the country as their ambitious targets will permit.
Right, and there's certainly a sense now that the Liberals do not believe there actually are any bad people.
Well, there's a serious naivete. Now, I need to qualify this. I don't want to. I may be overstating things because we do have a lot of dedicated folks in the security agencies. They're doing their best, I'm sure, with limited resources, but they're under the gun. Here's my point. Their bonuses, their promotions are geared to whether they hit the processing targets, not whether people come between the cracks that could pose a risk to us. And so I think we have not created the right incentives under the current government to focus adequately on the security imperative. That's what I'm trying to say.
That makes sense. Moving on to healthcare and the effect of immigration on healthcare, which should be a positive effect if it's done right. This morning, I saw a segment on CTV News about a doctor who was trying to come work at a clinic in Canada, yet the system is not making it easy for her to do so. She's over 1,000 people are waiting at that particular clinic for her help to come and work at it. and her name is Dr. Duncan. She said she's already been waiting for 2 years and counting. She calls for a more transparent and faster process. She says it took her 9 months just for her credentials to be certified. But the real sticking point, she says, is that her application lost points because she does not currently work in Canada or have relatives in Canada. And when she later applied for a labor market impact assessment, she said she couldn't get it approved because as a doctor in Canada, she would be paid by the government and not the clinic. So on the one hand, we have this massive increase in immigration, yet it's not fulfilling one of our fundamental urgent labor market needs, which is healthcare. So what's going on there?
Yeah, these kinds of cases are just incredibly maddening. And I think here's the point. Despite these extraordinarily high numbers, we still too often fail to accommodate people like that who are ideal immigrants in urgently needed occupations. I'll share with you a counterexample or another example. I got to know a Brazilian pediatric oncologist who was doing a fellowship at a hospital in Toronto last year, speaks fluent English, fluent French, obviously Portuguese, advanced degrees in a highly in-demand medical specialization of pediatric oncology. And, you know, yeah, he could have, in principle, well, he couldn't get through the system here. And now he's gone to move to Texas. What the actual hell is going on here? But
right. This is
no,
us
I'll tell you,
losing the
part of what's
brains.
going on, part of what's going on is because of this huge flow of temporary residents that the Liberal government has facilitated, foreign students, low-skilled temporary foreign workers. They know they've got a problem there. They've got 3 million plus of those folks, almost all of whom have the hope or expectation of landing permanent residency, plus an undefined number of people who are here illegally, overstayers. I think the modest estimates on that are like 500,000. I think it's probably much more. So let's say 4 million temporary residents and people who have overstayed. The Liberals know they've got a big problem on that. And so they're trying to squeeze as many of those people through the the permanent residency system to get landed as they can, which means that they've completely deformed what was the crown jewel of Canada's model immigration system, namely the point system selected people, federal skilled workers, or the Harper government turned that into something called express entry. So that used to select people based on a matrix of ascribing points based on their age. Younger gets more points, French or English language proficiency, their education, work experience, etc. So basically, that population of people who used to constitute the mainstay of Canadian economic immigrants, and because of that system, we were regarded as having a model in the world. They've been squeezing down those numbers of people. And instead, they've been trying to use those scarce 500,000 permanent residency spots to process foreign students and low-skilled temporary foreign workers. Now, as I said, you quoted me saying that a foreign student grad with a Canadian university degree who's fluent in English, et cetera, is going to do very well. The data suggests that. But not all foreign students are equal. And I don't say this with any pejoratively towards anybody. I mean, everybody comes, God bless them, but a lot of the study program, as we know, the foreign student program, has devolved into like 6-month diploma programs at dodgy career colleges who have agreements with particularly Ontario community colleges, where their study permit, their visa was arranged by often dodgy immigration agents overseas, promising that student and their family that they were going to get permanent residency. It's not like let me put it this way. Somebody who comes and does a graduate degree at McGill is not the same as somebody who's come and done 6-month diploma at the Brampton College of Hairdressing. Okay,
Right.
let's just put it that way.
This makes
And
sense.
so what the Liberals are doing is pushing more of the latter into the permanent residency category, squeezing out my Brazilian pediatric oncologist friend, and the American physician to whom you referred.
Right. So it seems to me like there should just be two separate streams. So moving on, in an interview with Steve Paikin in 2012, you took a lot of guff for your changes to the immigration guide, for laying out Canada's history, including both world wars as well as peacekeeping, its fight to remain a democratic nation, and also concerns that newcomers understand that women are equal in Canada, even if that's not necessarily the case in their home countries. Has it become more or less important for Canadian governments to ensure newcomers understand our history and democratic values, and why?
Yes, now more than ever. We've talked a lot about economic immigration and integrity in the system, but this comes back to my initial point as well about social integration. A little harder to measure, but one way you can measure it is what many call civic literacy. That is to say, literacy about our society, where it came from, how we developed it, what its institutions are, what the expectations and responsibilities are of citizens, et cetera. And when we came to office, the Harper government, we saw like the citizenship test that's required for people to take to demonstrate basic knowledge of Canada was frankly a bit of a joke. It was 20 multiple choice questions. Like, I exaggerate only slightly, but what are the colors of the Canadian flag? Like red and white or blue and green. I mean, it was so basic. And by the way, there was also mass fraud on that because immigration agents there was only 2 or 3 versions of the test. And so they were getting the answer keys and selling them to applicants. It was rubbish. So we ditched that and we went through a very deliberate, careful process to develop a new study guide called Discover Canada and a citizenship test on which it's based, which was really challenging. And
So you put some thought into it because
yeah,
newcomers do want to know about the country they're going
that's
to,
my
right?
point. My point is, let's not fall into the soft bigotry of low expectations. I believe that most immigrants are eager to become Canadian and to know something about this country. And I think very few people come to this country simply to recreate the societies that they have left. And so I think it's right for us to be in the same way that kind of the school system needs to have standards and test people on their competency. I think our citizenship program should do the same. We also increased the period of required residency to obtain citizenship from 3 to 4 years. We also raised the threshold for language proficiency and cut out the fraud that was happening on language testing and various other things. And that language and that citizenship guide and the test was very blunt. We said, for example, that Canada's belief in diversities does not extend to certain practices such as female genital mutilation, forced marriages, honor crimes, et cetera. These practices are condemned in Canada and are severely punished under our law. So we talked about the obligation, if called upon, to serve in the Canadian military in the defense of the country. Like this was Canadian patriotism, and I make no apologies about it. And by the way, the vast majority of people were able to pass it if they made an effort. And I think helped to increase that civic literacy. The Liberals, of course, have downgraded all of that. They took the citizenship requirement from 4 down to 3 years. Because this is a prime minister who says that Canada is the world's first post-national state which has no core identity.
Right. And of course, as a nation, if we don't define ourselves, then somebody else will define ourselves.
Or we just become, as Yann
well.
Martel, as the novelist Yann Martel said, we just become Hotel Canada. And let me just say this, I don't want it to be taken the wrong way, but I just saw a thoughtful article in The Hub today by King's College demographer Don Kerr, Professor Kerr, who estimates that over 30% of the Canadian population now has been born abroad. That's been a massive increase under the current government because of these numbers. Again, we're an open and welcoming country. I'm pro-immigrant. I ran the highest levels of sustained immigration in our history up to that point. But at what point do we have to ask ourselves, if you were to maintain the current velocity, right, of, let's call it 1.8 million newcomers a year between temporary and foreign, aren't we slowing down the integration process? Like, if people, given the tendency of many newcomers, quite sensibly, quite obviously, to go to communities where they have relatives or friends. You end up with enclaves, linguistic or cultural enclaves, where
And reduced social cohesion.
right, where
Well.
people may not be meeting people of other backgrounds, where they may be learning English or French less quickly. Um, I think that's limiting their Canadian experience in a way. So, I know these are sensitive issues, but the point is we need to have the courage to debate these questions, because if the immigrant experience is going to be a robust and successful one, if we're going to have that dream of integration, of unity in our diversity, not just diversity as its own end, then I think we're doing this the wrong way right now.
I agree. So we're going to move to some audience questions. First of all, I'm going to ask, we have a question here from, we've already covered the student question, so I'm going to move to this one. Some premiers are reluctant to keep taking more immigrants than their provinces can accommodate. Minister Miller recently referred to them as knuckleheads. He said funding would be offered, but what good is funding if there is no housing available, a shortage of nurses and doctors in hospitals, and a lack of teachers in schools that are overcrowded?
Specifically, I think the premiers to whom this question refers are talking about the federal effort to allocate asylum claimants to certain provinces, because most of the asylum claimants pour into Ontario and Quebec, and the Liberals, given their particular political sensitivity to Quebec and the forceful position of Premier Legault, they're trying to reallocate folks crossing the border into Quebec as asylum claimants to other provinces. And the other provinces are right to point out their own limited capacity, their own limited social services, food banks, housing, etc. But I have to, Terry, I have to just offer a little caveat here. When I was Premier of Alberta, especially coming out of COVID, I must tell you, and I'm not going to name names, but there were a number of premiers around the table who started pounding the table saying that their most important issue was they needed more immigrants, more newcomers urgently to address labor shortages. And I was pretty much the only voice around the table, at least for a long time, saying, as somebody with a depth of knowledge in immigration, be careful what you ask for. We already have a developing housing crisis in this country. This will only worsen it. But a lot of those premiers went to Ottawa, and I'm going to defend, well, give a qualified defense to the federal Liberals here. They were not only under pressure from the business community, they were also under pressure from a number of provinces to jack immigration numbers.
So given that by some estimates, real estate makes up to 40% of GDP, to what extent is immigration being used to shore up the economy of Canada? Would stopping immigration crash the economy?
Well, it is, as I said earlier, when Trudeau talks about Canada having fairly robust economic growth, really one of the fundamental things driving that is just increased demand. When you add, 1.5 million new people every year, when you're adding the equivalent of like 3% of the population per year, you're going to have that's going to have an effect on growth measured by absolute demand. But given the fact that most of those folks are making less than the average in Canada, it means declining per capita GDP, declining per capita incomes. So overall, we're becoming poor as a country. Now, on the second part of the question, I don't think anybody's proposing, if we were to stop immigration altogether, it would have a material impact on the economy. But nobody, I think, is proposing to go to zero, although I do think we require probably significant reductions in current levels across almost all of the programs until, at the very least, our housing market can start to catch up. By the way, a study just came out yesterday that was done partly by AI applications from Concordia School of Business, and they estimate, for example, that based on current immigration trends, the rent for an average two-bedroom apartment in the Greater Vancouver region will go from the current $3,400 a month, which is insane, to $5,200 a month by 2027 and $7,800 a month by 2032. Totally and obviously unsustainable.
Mm-hmm. Of course. the lack of supply. Um,
Well, no,
I have a
also
few
excess
questions.
demand. I'm sorry. There's just no way
Yeah.
you keep up with supply on that side. And I've been making this point for a long time.
Mhm.
You just like this, the demand side just is overwhelming. We have to deal with it.
Exactly. There's a few questions here that actually mimic my own. One of the questions is, how does an immigration minister or nation reconcile the fact that Canada values multiculturalism, diversity, and people coming to live here from all over the world, with the fact that we have certain values that we all agree on or feel we should all agree on, values that we consider paramount or essential, such as the equality of men and women and the rights of homosexuals?
Yeah, that's what we tried to express, that balance in the citizenship study guide that I published as minister about 2011 or 9, I guess it was, called Discover Canada. And we were very blunt about what those expectations are. You know, I disagree with Justin Trudeau. I do think we have a core national identity. We have you know, the reason why people around the world want to come to Canada is to enjoy and benefit from a country with a tradition of ordered liberty, parliamentary democratic institutions, the rule of law, protection of private property, a market capitalist economy, freedom of religion and pluralism. None of these things happen by accident. Most of these things are not enjoyed by most people around the world. And they came from a particular historical context that we inherited through our, acknowledging always the ancient historic presence of the Indigenous people in these lands. We also need to acknowledge that those advantages of a free, democratic society didn't happen by accident. They came through certain institutions and customs and laws and an historical development, in part rooted in the British parliamentary system and British common law, the Magna Carta. And we need to, I think, encourage people, not just newcomers, but people growing up, being educated, native-born Canadian kids in our education system, to appreciate these things. Can we guarantee that every immigrant to Canada is going to immediately become, accept what we might call core democratic values? No, I think that's a little unrealistic. But we can try to select folks who are going to have, like, I've always said this, I believe the best path to social integration is successful economic immigration. Part of the failure of social integration, that we see in Europe, with the race riots periodically in France and Britain, et cetera, the total lack of integration in certain parts of Europe, is because many of those people have been locked out of economic opportunity since they arrived, in part because they were very low skilled when they arrived. They were selected in the post-war years to go into factory jobs, never had access to language training programs and limited educational opportunities. So you ended up with initially guest worker populations that were kind of excluded from economic opportunity. Our selection of higher skilled immigrants through the point system meant more educated people who integrated economically more quickly, and therefore, I believe, socially more successfully. So I think that we have had a pretty, not a perfect, but a pretty successful model in Canada, and that's been deeply damaged in the past few years.
Okay. So as a closing question, if you were taking the reins of Canada's immigration system back from the Liberals tomorrow, I know you have no intention to return to the federal government, but what would be the most important changes you would make and why? Or maybe this would be advice that you would give for Mark Miller or any upcoming immigration minister. What would you fix? What would you work on first?
Well, first, I would seriously tap the brakes on the current unsustainable levels. I think Pierre Poilievre is right to say that a future government should, as a basic policy goal, align immigration intake with available housing. Because what's the point of bringing people here to face homelessness or totally unaffordable housing, and only to accelerate demand in the face? I just gave you those numbers about, we're looking at average rents in Vancouver, $5,200 3 years from now. In Toronto, average rents of almost that high. Like, it's just totally unsustainable. So getting the numbers back down to a manageable level that would also allow the system to take a breather. That would mean more capacity to do proper immigration security screening, but also going back and reinforcing the integrity of the system. I think, I know this sounds self-serving, but I heard at a C.D. Howe Institute, Mikhail Scootrud, who's, I think, the country's leading academic expert economist on immigration, was asked, what's the ideal immigration system? He said what Minister Kenney had 10 years ago. Rehan Salam is the president of a highly respected American think tank, the Manhattan Institute. He recently wrote a book partly about immigration. And he said the ideal immigration system is what the Harper government had in Canada 10 years ago. I'm not saying it was perfect, but going back and looking at how we reinforced integrity to combat, again, fake asylum claims, human smuggling, dodgy immigration consultants and diploma mills, looking at that whole package of integrity measures, bringing the overall numbers down, bringing these backlogs back down, and then refocusing the selected economic immigrants on the people with the highest levels of human capital, where we know are most likely to do best, like the two doctors about whom we've discussed. I think those are the key measures, but it's not going to happen until we get the numbers back down so the housing and healthcare and job markets can catch up.
That makes sense. So in addition to looking back at your own changes and your own reforms to the skilled worker program, which obviously in Ms. Duncan's case, the physician who wants to come to that clinic and serve those 1,000 patients, slowing perhaps other backlogs so that we can get these types of people into our system and match the needs of our economy, do you think that there does or doesn't need to be increased screening in all systems, including
Yes.
Sort of refugee as well as the student pathway, even for students at Ivy League universities?
Well, yeah, and when it comes to security screening, yes, absolutely. And we live in a dangerous world. We see that now more than ever. I think we're all asking ourselves, let's be blunt. When we see, we all saw the obscenities at the Vancouver Art Gallery on Sunday with people burning the Canadian flag while shouting, burn, burn Israel, death to Canada, death to the United States, death to Israel. I think we were all wondering, are there people in that crowd who have been admitted to Canada as guests, as foreign students or whatever? And if so, why would they be in this country? I think those are absolutely legitimate questions to ask. We have to move past the Trudeau government's era of childish naivete to recognize this is a magnificent country, but its virtues are fragile, and we need to be more realistic and hard-headed about these things, generous and open-minded. I think the right model is hard-headed but soft-hearted.
I think that would be wise. Mr. Kenney, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and answering my questions. And I also want to thank the audience for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Terry. I really appreciated it.
Thank you.
Take care.